And can you hear me clearly?
We can.
Very good. Thank you very much. All right. I'd like to welcome everybody to this session, and I would like to thank TC Dojo for putting this on and to thank Liz for inviting me. So what I want to do today very quickly, because we've got 30 minutes to discuss this, is discuss a question that's actually not new. This question has been with us, as you'll see as I go through this, for years. It's actually been with us for decades. But it's coming to be more and more important now as we go to mobile, and the question is, what do we do with existing content? Do we rewrite it or cut it? So, very quick background. This is me. I've been writing for online since '86. I actually wrote the second and third hypertext systems, hypertext products ever released. And to put this in some perspective, they were online users guides for MS-DOS 2.1. If anybody wants to giggle, go ahead, I'm used to it. And Lotus 123 2.01. So this actually predated Windows. This would run on the old white text, black background ASCII screens. But the reason that I mentioned it, aside from just getting cheap laughs, is the fact that the tool that I was using, or the compiler that I was using at the time, limited me to 3,000 characters per topic, period. And that wasn't 3,000 words. That was 3,000 characters, letters, spaces, punctuation marks. And that was sort of like a trial and introduction by fire to writing in really tight, short chunks. So writing for online since '86, writing for mobile, working with mobile since Windows CE and the old wireless markup language, wireless application protocol around '98. I'm certified right now in a tool called VisiApps, which is, think of this as RoboHelp or Flare for mobile apps, for native apps. Plus, I'm certified in Flare, Madcap Mimic, and Adobe RoboHelp. So I've been using a lot of these tools. For a while. By the way, I'm going to be muting occasionally. I'm getting over sort of a sore throat. I don't want to hack in anybody's ear. So, and I have been certified in various other tools, some of which have just lapsed, some of which have died, but I've been doing this for a long time. So, that said, here's the question. As mobile is starting to hit us, what should we do? How do we write for it? Do we take our existing material and just rewrite it to shorten it? Do we cut it, or do we do both? And I'll say that this question today goes beyond just simple writing, because today's technical communication is so much more technical than it was 10 years ago, and especially 20 or 25 years ago when online help really started permeating our world. There are issues that we have to deal with today that I didn't have to deal with in 1995 when I started creating online help systems or websites, because back then, if the question was how should we write for mobile, we didn't have the technical issues. It was almost like saying we have written material that displays on an 8.5 by 11 screen, or 8.5 by 11 page, sorry, and now all of a sudden we need to repurpose it to a 7 by 9 page. How do we do it? And the answer was, you'd have to cut, you'd have to rewrite, but it was writing. It was still text. There were no technical issues, which is why I say that this is now a more complex version of what we went through in the early '90s when the big theme was no dumping. In other words, don't just take your hard copy documentation and dump it into a help system, but actually rewrite it, revise it, cut it, etc., to really make good use of it. And because of this, because of the technical complexity, what I'm going to do is go off at what may seem like a tangent initially to say that we talk a lot about mobile, and I'm making little air quotes around the word mobile, But there are so many different issues, technical issues, design issues, support issues involved in mobile, that without defining what we're talking about, it's easy to make the wrong decision. So, question, what is mobile? This was once mobile. I never had this. This was the old Osborne 1 portable, but I did have this. This was a Compact 1 portable, and this thing cost $5,000 in the around 86, 85, 86. I had one, and I actually remember walking through Logan Airport in Boston and having people come up to me and saying in hushed tones, "Is that a computer?" And I didn't quite say, "Yes, little person, you may touch it," but there was really that air of carrying something that was cutting edge. And of course, we've gone way past this since this monster weighed about 30 pounds. But since then, the term mobile, of course, has come to mean this, or this, or this, smartphone. So in other words, the term itself is very vague. Here's another issue. I just grabbed these two off the internet. What you see on the left is a shot that I grabbed. Screen size is based on pixel dimensions. What you see on the right is screen resolution based in pixels per inch. And there's so many variations here that this is where the technical issues come into play. And I tried to describe this to somebody once and trying to say, what is mobile? And I wound up saying eventually it's the undesktop. In other words, it's something that I'm going to use off the desktop. On what? I don't know. Depends. You tell me. So if we're talking about mobile, if we're talking about apps, apps are typically the apps that we know, like Angry Birds, are typically function-centric. They have some function. So here, for example, is an app that I created for a church outside Boston, very function-centric. Here's another one. I created this last year for a technology incubation conference at MIT in Boston. And here's another one that I worked on 2 years ago. It's a maintenance record-keeping app for motorcycle users. And there's very little text in these things. The one you see, the Innowvation, the one on the right, out of all the typical apps that I've created, this is probably the most wordy. And you can see there's not much here. But you can create apps that are content-centric. And when we do, these are, as I say, effectively tech comp. So, for example, I'm an amateur astronomer, and here's an app that I use to keep track of a type of object called Messier objects. So here's a picture of the M1 Crab Nebula. Here's the body text. So, this is a chunk of text. Although, if you look at this, there's very little text here. All the text in the description of M1 ends at the end of that bottom paragraph, which has it's about 5 or 6 lines long. So there isn't much text here. But I would argue that this is tech comp because it's text, some graphics. Here's another one, and this is a great example because if you just go online, go to the App Store, go to the Play Store, I don't care if you're religious or not, just look at the Bibles, because these are Bibles that are text, largely, online in the form of apps. And there's lots of text here. So, what about this? This is mobile, but a tablet sort of sits in between a desktop and a smartphone. And remember, there are new devices coming out all the time that fall under the heading of mobile. Obviously, Google Glass potentially is one, although interestingly, Google Glass in some respects may have more in common with a desktop PC than it might with a smartphone. So again, there's a lot of issues. So the question is, what can we write for mobile? The answer is, yeah, we can. but it depends what we're talking about, and we have to specify. A laptop is certainly mobile, but it's basically a PC. A tablet is a small laptop with no keyboard. Smartphone is something else entirely, and if we're talking about, are we talking about web apps on phones or native apps versus hybrid apps, all of which have very different requirements, including native and hybrid apps typically are created using app development tools, but web apps we can create using tech-com tools like help authoring tools like RoboHelp and Flare. So we are getting into kind of a mid-ground here between what technical communicators can do, because we don't think of technical communicators, or at least my experience, in discussing mobile in the tech-com world, and I've been discussing this probably for about 4 or 5 years. Every time I speak at a conference, if the venue is appropriate, or every time I do a Flare or RoboHelp class, I will always ask, how many of you are thinking about going mobile? And over the last few years, I've seen the number of hands go up from maybe 1% to probably about 50%. But my experience also is that when I say, who's doing it? You know, your company is going mobile. Are you the ones, the tech-com people, who are going to be doing it? And the answer is typically no. It's the IT people or engineering. But we have features now, in particular this technology or this design methodology called responsive design, that allows us to create content, to output content that is display agnostic. In other words, there's an example here from RoboHelp 11, and if you look carefully, it's the same file, it's the same topic, but if you look carefully, you'll notice that the display differs depending on whether you're looking at a full screen or a tablet or over at the bottom right, a smartphone. And you know, obviously the size ratios aren't quite right, but just sort of go with me here in the sense of these are different size screens. And what's important is look at what's on the design of each screen. You see how they differ? In other words, in the big one in the background, we have the Greek temple and we have navigation over on the left, and we have the Adobe icon. On the tablet at the bottom right, we still have the Greek temple, we still have the Adobe icon, but navigation has now been moved to a vertical tab on the right side of the screen. And when you go to the smartphone, the Greek temple is gone, the Adobe logo is gone, and navigation has been pushed to the bottom. And for those of you who aren't familiar with responsive design, you might be looking at this and thinking, big deal. The developer created 3 different outputs optimized for 3 different size devices. And the answer is no. This is one output that will automatically optimize itself depending on what the output device is. It's a huge development. So, but by the same token, just because the screens can be automatically adapted to doesn't mean that the content might. For example, and what you're seeing here is based on experience, unfortunately my own, much of which has been fairly bloody, but you might have images. This is very common. Images are too wide for a phone screen or sometimes even a tablet. So we can size images so-called relatively, using so-called relative size units like percentages. So rather than specifying that an image should be 500 pixels wide, we can say an image should be 90% wide. And then the image will automatically size itself under the control of the browser based on the amount of screen space that's available. So that's great. Problem is, if you shrink the image down to make sure it fits inside the available space, it may not be legible. At which point you have to decide, okay, this image is not legible when it's viewed on a smartphone, therefore, great, I'll use conditional build tags and just turn the display of the image off for anything smaller than, say, a 19-inch desktop monitor. Except the only problem is did you refer to that image in the text? And does that mean you have to go back and modify, edit the text to possibly remove mention of the image or possibly rewrite? In other words, cut that mention of the image, or sticking with the theme of this presentation, rewrite the text so that you have two different versions of the phrasing depending on whether or not the image is there. Your content may have to become increasingly granular. In other words, you write more and more smaller and smaller topics to make it easy to adjust what gets pushed out onto a device. But the danger here is that you can wind up getting much too big, having way too many topics. Most people that I run into have projects in the 1,000 or so topic range, so you might have, say, 2,000 or 3,000 files. But I did have a client last year that had 173,500 topics, and which I found pretty impressive until I talked to a guy I know in Denmark who told me that actually what he said was, we have 300,000 topics. And I was talking to somebody else who was taking an old DITA project and converting it back to XHTML, and he said they wound up with over 1 million chunks of content. Problem is, this stuff can be almost unmanageable. And everything that I just said regarding graphics pretty much applies to tables as well. So again, the content, the quantity of content that you have can become difficult. SWIFTs, any movies that you create using Adobe Captivate, TechSmith Camtasia, Madcap Mimic, and any one of about 24 other such tools, we tend to create those as Flash output because that's pretty much what we've always done, except while it's really easy to insert one of these Flash movies into a topic and have it display on a website or on a 19-inch monitor, if you're generating something that's going to be displayed on an iPhone or an iPad, for example, Flash won't work, which means you're going to have to know more about again, the technical side of the display of your content. If you're generating ebooks, again, ebook table support is just lousy. It's getting better, but all that cool stuff that you do with tables and nested tables, much of it won't work. And there's various other problems as well. I've actually seen cases where people were sure that they had none of these annoying, tricky things that I've just talked about, but they forgot that they had created snippets. And they had inserted some of these annoying, tricky things in the snippets and then promptly forgot about them because we don't really look at snippets that often. We want to cut down text. And I'm not talking about cutting fat, which we all do. I've been a columnist for various journals for about 14 years, and I find when I write a column, I'll just sit down and do a brain dump on the subject, and I'll wind up with about 2,400 words. And then I'll go through, cut out all the fat and the uhs, and that cuts it down to about 1,600. And then a final cleanup pass where I'm actually starting to cut down to the bone, real text, to get down to about 1,200 words. So here's an example. I don't know if this rings a bell. If one land, if two sea, ride, spread alarm, which is, of course, with apologies to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, this is the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, somewhat shortened. So how do we deal with this stuff? Well, have you reviewed your content lately for legacy content? Because if you're working on a project that's been around for a while, there's a good chance that it contains some legacy stuff that made sense when it was written but may not make sense now. For example, up until about a decade ago, anytime you wrote a PC user's guide, there was always, or even software user's guides, there would be a section in there on how to use a mouse. And eventually, we sort of took it for granted that everybody knows how to use a mouse, which is not always true. But generally, we assume people now know how to use a mouse. We don't have to tell them, how do you hold a mouse? I remember writing stuff like that. Now that floppy disk drives are gone, we no longer have to write descriptions of how to open and close the floppy disk drive door, which I used to write. Then there's domain knowledge. There was a time back in the old days, and a lot of people still do this, where we would tend to write not only operating instructions, but the background domain knowledge as well. So, for example, I had a client in California about 4 years ago that sold accounting software, and their documentation was great. The person who had written the user guide had actually not only explained how to use the software, but had explained the background accounting principles as well, and did a bang-up job. The only problem was that the doc was something like 1,700 pages long, and users were complaining that they knew there was information in there that they wanted, but they just couldn't find it. And finally, the company decided, all right, if somebody doesn't know what double declining, what sum of the year's digits fixed asset depreciation is, they shouldn't be using our software in the first place, and we shouldn't have to tell them what that is. And they wound up stripping all the descriptions, all the domain stuff out, and I'd say they cut it down to, I don't remember exactly, but I'd say 700 pages. So they knocked out 1,000 pages of material. Is there stuff in there that's just no longer applicable? Or to put it another way, when's the last time anybody has looked at the documentation to see if there's anything that should be stripped out? I had a client, an HMO in Connecticut a few years ago, that had, they brought me in to do a conversion, to convert 3,500 pages of material from pre-HTML to HTML, and I sort of innocently said, when's the last time anybody's looked at this stuff? And they said, well, never. And I said, look, why don't you review it and see if there's anything you can get rid of so that you're not paying me to convert stuff which you're promptly going to throw out. Give me a call when you're ready. And a couple of weeks later, my phone rang, and I said hello, and this voice said hello and started laughing. And I recognized her, and I said, okay, how many pages do you have left? And this is out of about 3,500 pages to start with. They cut it down to 900 pages just by cutting out stuff that was no longer applicable. So in general, can you cut out content that just doesn't apply at all? And can you cut out content that may not apply to mobile, but that you may still want to make available for other reasons? Oop, hang on a second. So then my question is, if you do, in other words, you strip content out of the mobile side, but you still want to make it available, where do you put it? And as I was telling Liz, when we first discussed this presentation, I had the perfect example. One of my hobbies is maritime history, naval history, and in 1993, I wanted to try creating a multimedia project with the technology of the day, and I created a multimedia lesson about this little-known naval battle at during the opening of World War II. And I had 15 frames that described the action. Basically what I did in 1993 was create sort of like a very primitive version of Adobe Captivate. So on each frame, I had pop-ups, I had audio. I don't think I ever got around to video, but I was planning to do video. But I had 15 frames that described the action. And on average, there were about 2 paragraphs of text per frame. And as I told the TC Dojo people, I turned my office upside down, and I cannot find this thing. So there's one last place to look, which is on a hard disk that's 20 years old, which I couldn't even read. So I'm hoping that I still have it, but this teaches me never to clean up my office. The thing is, I boiled this down from my primary source, which was a book by a Harvard historian named Samuel Eliot Morison, who wrote this, I think, a 13-volume series called History of U.S. Naval Operations in World War II, and he probably distilled those 75 pages from thousands of pages of source documents from U.S. Navy and Imperial Japanese Navy archives. So there was no web for all intents and purposes in '93. So when I cut those 75, when I boiled 75 pages down to about 5, in effect I lost 70 pages. The thing is, if you're doing this, can you make the material available if the users need it? And let me sum this up. Should we rewrite or should we cut? And I'm going to give you, those of you who've heard me speak know that I'm apparently notorious for saying it depends as the answer to almost every question, and sticking with that tradition, I'll do it again. It depends. We want to cut just to shorten the content, to strip out material that's no longer applicable. We also want to cut in order to strip out material either permanently removed or sort of conditionally removed to account for technical limitations. Again, the idea, for example, that a Flash movie created using Adobe Captivate is certainly content, but it won't display on an iPad. So you better be able to cut it out or conditionally cut it out. But we want to make that content available if it's still important. So perhaps I cut out the content, but I make it available to my readers by giving them, say, a QR code that they can scan with their cell phone and jump to the content, and then rewrite the remainder. And just tear the living daylights out of it. You all know the theory about editing being the writer's equivalent of bloodletting, because we're just cutting and cutting, and it's difficult to do. But the more we cut, the better off we are, up to a point. And I'll sum this up by saying we still want good writing, but we just want less of it. And we want it more focused on the user's needs. So you're going to wind up doing both. You're going to wind up cutting to shorten the content, and again, to account for any technical limitations, and then just rewrite what's left to make it shorter. And the result will be better writing, which we can in turn take from mobile and in many cases turn around and use it for the general documentation as well. Because if it's good writing and it's short and clear, that should be just as applicable for the stuff that gets read on a 19-inch desktop or the stuff that gets printed. All right, so that, as I say, is the it depends portion of this presentation. This is the blatant sales pitch, and this is the important point at the end. I believe we have about 2 minutes, so
we have
if
one
we don't
question.
get to answer any questions.
Alrighty.
Okay, sure.
And while you rest of you type in your questions, we'll get this one answered and show you what else is coming up on the TC Dojo. So here's a question that came in a couple of minutes ago. The question is, do you categorize tasks by device? Also, what of translation?
Interesting question. Do I categorize tasks by device? If applicable, yes. In other words, there are certain things, okay, whoever asked this question, I'll apologize ahead of time and say it depends. Because it depends on what you're calling a task. In other words, I would say that, what's an example? I would say that doing a sales calculation, doing a sales ROI calculation is something that I would do no matter what device I was using, whether it was a desktop, a tablet, or a phone. But I might also categorize tasks based on the devices on which they would be performed. So, in other words, when I said this was a more when I said back at the beginning that this was a more complex environment, but similar to the old no dumping issue of the early 90s, that's true. Back then, we still had to categorize information. We had to learn to do that. We're still doing that today, but now we have to categorize not only by task, but by device-related task. So I'd say the answer is yes. As far as translation is concerned, translation is a horrible job.
Did we lose you, Neil?
Worked on a translation project in years. I tend to pass them off to people I know who specialize in that. But what I learned years ago was to go from English to any Romance language except German increases the length by about 30%. Go to German, you double it. And I honestly don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, no, it's always an issue dealing with that. Okay, here
Yep.
we have the next one. Can you describe the difference between responsive design and adaptive design?
Yes, but not in 30 seconds. So what we're going to do is I've asked Liz and Janice to record the questions that people have. They'll send me a list of the questions. I will answer them on paper over the next day or so, get them back to you, or get them back to Liz and Janice, and they'll send them out to you. So I'm going to ask you to let me respond to that one on paper.
All right, that's a good one. And here we have one more comment on your last one before I get to the next question. I agree, German translation doubles the content size. Yes, yes it does.
Thank you. All right. The wonderful people, but they have a bad habit of ramming 3 or 4 words together and creating a new one out of it. And I will say that I was involved in the translation effort for Lotus Notes back in 1990, and Lotus sent me to Europe for a week to work with the translators. And I spent 2 hours one afternoon debating with the translators what the proper wording would be for user privileges in German that would still fit on the screen.
Wow. What'd you come up with?
I don't remember, and it's possible that we never did. I'm sure we did, but I honestly don't remember. But I just remember being so struck that we spent 2 hours debating the meaning of user privileges in order to try to figure out what word we could use that would fit in a button.
So our questioner continues. He says, you start wondering whether your content in English is correct when you're ramming it all together.
Yes, and this is why whoever has this question, if you do translation, as I said, all my respect, my hat's off to you. I think this is one of the most difficult jobs in TechCom.
I agree. It is really not simple in any respect. He says, yes, he's Vidya from India, and he is doing it. All right, well, maybe we had to have Vidya come in and be a translation dojo master. I think that sounds like a great idea, actually.
I think that would be a great idea. I'll be there. I'll be in the audience.
All right, great. We have one more question. Is RoboHope, Flare, etc. meant that you mentioned, is that needed to do the cut for mobile writing?
Do you need that to do the cut for mobile writing? No. In a very, very quick nutshell, RoboHelp, Flare, all the help authoring tools or hats are pretty much, they're writing tools that were developed to cut a lot of history. They were developed with a focus toward creating online documentation that would display on a desktop screen or a laptop screen, a big screen. But these tools have gone far beyond being help authoring tools years ago. And in effect, what they really are authoring environments for writing. And as part of that environmental support, They allow you to create content with a view toward pushing that content out for display on devices other than desktops and laptops. In other words, tablets, smartphones, and who knows what else is coming along. So the short answer is yes, you can certainly use these tools, and the tools themselves have features that allow you to take your content and convert it to mobile form. In other words, using Flare, I can output my content to a web app. This would be something that would run in a smartphone, but it's tied to the browser on the phone. It's not tied to the phone like an iPhone app or an Android app. Flare does that. RoboHelp does that. RoboHelp, interestingly, also allows you to output your help projects, to output a project to a true native app. So I can actually output it in the form of an iPhone app or an Android app. This is very little used yet, but it's an interesting feature, and I thought it was a very far-reaching decision on Adobe's part to do this. On the other hand, do you need these tools? No. I can write content that will be used on a mobile device in Word or Notepad. So these tools, the help authoring tools, offer a number of development conveniences, but you don't need them. Did that make sense?
Well, yeah, we'll let her respond in a minute. She says yes. Sounds good.
Okay.
All right. So before you go, and just in case there's any more questions coming in, looks like Vidya definitely is going to do a translation session, which is awesome. That's one of the it's one of the many voted on topics. All right. Thank you, Neil. You're amazing. I knew it would be. You're the master of mobile, everything, and everybody knows it. No questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming, and I hope this is useful, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the audience with me or with you at an upcoming session. Thank you very much. Liz, back to you.
All right, thanks. Next month we've got John Hedke. He's going to talk about writing collaboratively in distributed teams, so people who are not anywhere near you. What do you do? How do you do it? And he's always worked this way. When I asked around who should talk about it, everybody said John. So he's coming in April. That's going to be the next TC Dojo open session. These sessions are recorded, so if you miss it, it's okay. We've still got this one too. We have an Arbortext edition. We're going to show you how to do 2 style sheets in one. Really, it's kind of fun, and that's in the end, a couple of weeks from now. Our master series is a little bit different. It's kind of like getting together with your board members. And there's no presentation. This is more dynamic, and topics come up as people are dealing with them, and we all learn from each other. It's really kind of an interesting thing, and there's 2 eyes in my April. All right. Be sure to vote on your choice of upcoming session topics. TC Dojo is about you. We don't just want to put on sessions that we think you want to hear about. We want to talk about what you care about, and vote often, early, and frequently, because as you suggest topics, the list of session topics changes, and that's the survey link at the bottom. Let's see if we have any more questions. We have one more. Are the slides going to be available for them to keep?
Yes. I can send you a copy of the final presentation that I displayed, and feel free to pass them out to anyone who wants them.
Okay, great. And definitely send us a link to, if you've got it posted on SlideShare, we'll do that too. That's always awesome. I don't see any more questions, but a great big thanks, Neil, from one of the people who came.
Very good. Thank you very much. Awesome. You guys all have a good day.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.